Good morning, everyone. This is Class 18, our second class for the week on liberal theories of justice, and today we're going to be looking at the work of Friedrich von Hayek, who you might be more familiar with in economics terms, but we're going to be thinking a little bit about his political thought here. We're going to look at his critique of social justice and his account of liberty. And then towards the end of this lecture, we're going to compare and evaluate Hayek and Rawls on the relationship between justice and equality. So a little bit about Hayek to get us started. Hayek was an Austrian born in 1899. He served as an artillery captain during World War I. After the war, he studied at law and political science, receiving doctorate degrees in both at the University of Vienna. And while he was originally sympathetic to democratic socialism, he claims that he was converted to classical liberalism by the Austrian economist and philosopher Ludwig von Mises. Eventually, he received a post on the faculty of the London School of Economics, where he gained fame for his work on economic theory. He eventually won the Nobel Prize for his work on the business cycle, and he also was famous for this idea of the economic calculation problem, that market systems were so complex and interconnected that it would be impossible for us to have enough information in advance to predict the number of goods and services that we would need and what prices things should be set at. And he used this argument to critique socialist central planned economies, arguing that they were always going to be plagued with either scarcity or excess because you couldn't calculate in advance everything that was needed. In the 1930s, he was critical of the influential economist John Maynard Keynes on macroeconomic theory and policy, and this was a kind of origins of the supply versus demand side of debates. And eventually, after the war, he took a post at the University of Chicago, where he met Milton Friedman, became associated with the Chicago School of Free Market Orthodoxy, and was more closely associated with the idea of Austrian economics, with people like von Mises, Karl Menger, and Karl Popper. We're less interested in his economic thought here than his political thought, and it's important here that to contextualize Hayek's politics in a series of mid-20th century efforts to determine the intellectual contours of the post-World War II order. What is the kind of intellectual worldview going to look like after the end of World War II? As early as 1938, he participated in the Colloque Walter Lippmann in Paris, in which a number of leading political scientists, philosophers, and economists attempted to articulate a defense of liberal political economic order that would negotiate between old-school liberalism, socialism, and fascism. This is actually where the term neoliberalism comes from, this colloquium in Paris during 1938. And after World War II, there was a significant concern among Hayek and others on the kind of right spectrum of intellectuals that socialism was ascendant in the academy and that would lead to the destruction of the liberal world order. In 1944, he published The Road to Serfdom to try to show that the well-intentioned arguments for socialism and central planning as a response to the Great Depression would just as likely lead to authoritarianism. He was also one of the founders and the first president of the Mont Pèlerin Society, which was an organization of economists, political scientists, and others aimed at promoting the ideas of classical liberalism. And as you can see over here from the statement of aims of the Mont Pèlerin Society, they write that over large stretches of the Earth's surface, the essential conditions of human dignity and freedom have already disappeared. In others, they are under constant menace from the development of current tendencies of policy. The notion of the individual and the voluntary group are progressively undermined by extensions of arbitrary power. Even the most precious possession of Western man, freedom of thought and expression, is threatened by the spread of creeds which, claiming the privilege of tolerance when in the position of the minority, seek only to establish the position of power in which they can suppress and obliterate all views but their own. So for a little bit of more kind of background and detail on the Mont Pèlerin Society, there's a short video clip here.
The Soviet Union is actively communism to Eastern Europe. Mao Zedong is leading the communist revolution in China. To noted Austrian economist and eventual Nobel Prize winner Friedrich von Hayek, these are ominous signs. In the spring of 1947, he invites an elite group of economists, political scientists, historians, and other intellectuals, including Milton Friedman, to consider the consequences. They call themselves the Mont Pèlerin Society, the Swiss town where they held their first meeting.
So far as I personally was concerned, it was a very thrilling meeting. It was the first time I was overseas, the first time I ever met economists, political scientists, and others from other countries around the world. And it was organized because as of that time, the number of people around the world who were firm supporters of liberty, of a classical liberal point of view about human society, were very few and far between, beleaguered wherever they were as a small minority.
He came on the scene with what were perceived to be radical ideas in the 1950s and the 1960s, largely because the influence of John Maynard Keynes was about fully pervasive, if I may put it that way.
Chicago economists were not popular. Friedman led that group in not being popular, but we felt we had something to say because of what we learned, and it was exhilarating.
So you'll notice from that video that a series of future Nobel laureates, Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, all kind of emerge out of this society that has its roots in the concern that liberal in the sense of classical liberalism, or closer to what we would now call libertarianism, that these views were kind of being pushed out of the academy. In 1960, Hayek published A Constitution of Liberty, which was intended to be the definitive statement of Hayek's political philosophy. He argued that civilization was only possible by having this kind of fundamental principle of liberty, which was a prerequisite, he argued, for wealth and growth. This is a book that was famously held up by Margaret Thatcher in a British Conservative Party meeting when she interrupted a presentation to indicate, holding up this book and saying, "This is what we believe." And now, while Hayek and others felt that they were being excluded from the formal academy outside of universities, their success really lies in the creation of a kind of like alternative network of intellectuals. As in his 2014 book, the British historian Daniel Stedman Jones argued that Hayek and the Mont Pèlerin Society made good on their promises to try to recreate an alternative intellectual ecosystem, and they built a transatlantic system of think tanks and organizations aimed at limited government regulation of the economy and individual liberty. And then when the economic and political crises of the late 70s took up, they were well positioned with a series of policy proposals and arguments that were taken up by conservative leaders in both the UK and the US, and have remained fairly ascendant and dominant since. So Hayek's economic and political philosophy was not really abstracted from the more concrete political concerns that you can't kind of separate out his theory from his attempts to actually influence political practice. So to get started with Hayek, it's important. I'm going to be referring to two different texts. In this mini lecture, the reading that you were assigned is from Law, Legislation, and Liberty, Volume 2, The Mirage of Social Justice. This was published in 1976, so when you see 1976 in the parentheses on the slides, that's what I'm referring to. But to flesh this out, I've also included some quotations from the Constitution of Liberty, so if you see passages that you weren't familiar with, that's because they weren't in the reading, and so don't be alarmed, but I just wanted to include them to provide some further detail. So Hayek's argument against social justice begins with a series of assumptions, the first of which is the is an assumption that I think that probably everyone would agree with, that people are unique, and he describes in the Constitution of Liberty the boundless variety of human nature. And by this he means both natural endowments and also social inequalities. Writing in the Constitution of Liberty, the inborn as well as the acquired gifts of a person clearly have a value to his fellows which does not depend on any credit due to him for possessing them. And so he's kind of accepting that these are going to generate inequalities that come from family, inheritance, education. And he kind of accepts this factical equality. But you'll notice from that quote that I just read that this does not depend on any credit due to him for possessing them. That he agrees with Rawls in some respects that these are morally arbitrary. And we'll see he comes to very different conclusions with that same assumption, but he's assuming that there are differences due to both natural endowment and social circumstances that differentiate human beings. His second assumption is that we have limited knowledge of each other and of social systems, that no man or group of men possesses the capacity to determine conclusively the potentialities of other human beings, that we should certainly never trust anyone invariable to exercise such a capacity. And this stems from both the kind of, as I suggested earlier, the complexity of social and market systems, but for Hayek it also means that we simply can't know with 100% certainty what another person is thinking or valuing. And that any attempt to kind of determine universal systems of value is going to be undermined, because if we especially when we combine with this first assumption, right? If we assume that everyone is different, that people have, based on their natural endowments and social circumstances, that they're going to have different sets of values and preferences and beliefs, it's impossible for us to know or to gain the kind of knowledge that we would have to assign a universal value. So we have limited knowledge over things. Finally, he argues that we should evaluate the outcomes of a society on the basis of the good of the society as a whole. And here we are looking. Here we have the first major break with the Rawlsian kind of paradigm, that where Rawls argues fairly strongly in A Theory of Justice against this average utility principle, instead arguing that we should distribute justice through the difference principle, through the minimax interpretation in particular. Hayek's arguing that we want to look at kind of, are the benefits conferred to the community as a whole positive or negative? And that means that he's willing to accept that there is going to be some winners and some losers, and there's going to be inequality, but as long as the community as a whole is enhanced, he's going to justify it. So then we get to a series of more political assumptions that are more explicit in the reading that you were assigned. The first is that he rejects the idea that society is a thing. And again, this should sound familiar to Rawls's idea of society as a system of mutual cooperation, but Hayek describes society in terms of impersonal processes. And he writes that these bring about a greater satisfaction of human desires than any deliberate human organization could achieve. You might be familiar with the idea of spontaneous order, but this is what Hayek is talking about here, that we shouldn't think of the market as some sort of like designed system, but as a kind of spontaneously generating system of organization, that through impersonal processes like supply and demand and through the large aggregate of individual behavior, we get a stable system, but this is not a system that kind of pre-exists these processes or these interactions or these behaviors or the people taking part in them, nor is it something that is designed and controlled from the top down. It's kind of an emergent order, an emergent property. And other times in the reading, he describes this as a catalaxy, where it's this idea of a kind of emergent, spontaneous order. And this system is coordinated by market price signals. That the market price signals coordinate behavior, but he's insistent that these do not have any sort of moral value. They do not reward merit or desert. That these are simply the result of letting price signals set the set the price of goods based on what people are willing to pay for them. That this is not an account of merit. He draws several distinctions between merit and value, and he's basically saying that we value things based on that we can assign value based on the price that people are willing to pay for your good or service. That's not saying that that goods or services that are priced higher are more are worth more in a kind of a moral sense, or that respond to hard work, but simply responding to what people are willing to pay for that. And then finally, because Hayek is a liberal in the classical sense, he argues that if we're going to have coercion, it has to be justified. This is the kind of calling back to Locke here. And in the Constitution of Liberty, he writes, if we wish to preserve a free society, it is essential that we recognize that the desirability of a particular object is not sufficient justification for the use of coercion. That the ends don't necessarily justify the means for Hayek, that we need to have a very high threshold for justifying coercion. And as he writes in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, and your reading for today, the prior question is whether it is moral that men be subjected to powers of direction that would have to be exercised in order that the benefits derived by the individuals could be meaningfully described as just or unjust. So when we're evaluating a just or unjust redistribution of resources, we have to answer the first question of, are we justified in using the state using state coercive power to realize that distribution? So where Rawls doesn't really answer the question of like how would we achieve this distribution, Hayek says that this is the prior question. If we can't justify the use of coercion and violence to achieve this, then it doesn't matter if it's a good idea or not. We have to have a very high threshold for justifying coercion. So we're going to talk about the arguments that he makes from these assumptions to critique a theory of social justice in just a second, but if you need to take a break and pause this video, now would be a good time. So, Hayek draws a series of arguments from these assumptions of distinct persons, imperfect knowledge, aggregate good, the non-existence of society, the use of the function of price signals, and the justification of coercion. The first argument he makes is it sounds like more of a philosophical question, but he's arguing that social justice as a term is a meaningless idea. It doesn't make any sense to talk about the social systems of distribution that Rawls is talking about as being just or unjust, because market forces don't have a moral value. They don't reward merit. So there's no such thing as just or unjust distributions, that we're using the wrong term to describe these things. However, he then draws the stronger argument that because there is no such thing as social justice, any attempts to impose social justice will not only fail, but lead to the illiberal violation of individual freedom. That he's concerned that this constant attempt that will always fail to achieve social justice will lead to totalitarianism. He says so very explicitly. So let's work through the first argument first. This is what he calls the Mirage of social justice, which is the subtitle to this volume of Law, Legislation, and Liberty. And the key idea here is that market relations are based on value, not merit or desert. That markets do not reward you for hard work, they do not reward merit, they do not give you what you deserve, that the market is instead, he writes in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, a reflection of consumer value. The remunerations which the individuals and groups receive in the market are thus determined by what these services are worth to those who receive them. It is not a claim that when you are being paid for a good or service, it is not a claim that you deserve that, or that you have worked hard, or that your work is good. It is simply an expression of what those goods or services are valuable to the consumer. That this is the amount of someone is able to collect on something is not a claim about their moral value. It is a claim about what goods or services they are able to provide and what others are willing to pay for them. So because we have differences in persons, that means that we're going to have different people are going to be able to produce different goods and services. And we have differences in value, that people value different goods and services differently, that we're going to have inequality in market outcomes. And that this is, for Hayek, as close to natural and inevitable as possible, that you are inevitably going to have differentiation in the market outcomes, and there's going to be inequality, but this inequality is not, again, a moral valuation, that it is a completely amoral system, that this is distributing scarce resources on the basis of consumer value, not on sort of any moral claim of desert or merit. And so to apply justice, which is all about kind of moral desert and for Hayek, to the question of social distributions is what he calls a category mistake, or what we could call a category mistake. It's using this term incorrectly. And we can see this more clearly in a passage from the Constitution of Liberty, where he defines what justice should be should concern itself with. So he writes here that justice, like liberty and coercion, is a concept which, for the sake of clarity, ought to be confined to the deliberate treatment of men by other men. That when we're talking about justice, we're talking about how we treat each other directly and deliberately. It is not a kind of function of the overall distribution of goods in a system. That doesn't make sense to talk about justice there. And it's this intentional determination that is the only thing that we can talk about justice for. So if you are it requires some person to act unjustly towards another person. And when we're talking about social justice, he writes in Law, Legislation, and Liberty that there is no answer to the question of who has been unjust, because society is not, as we discussed earlier, an intentional creation from some agent, that there is no such thing as someone who is acting unjustly in the creation of unequal distributions of goods and services and wealth in society. And so we kind of make this error in which society becomes the new deity that he writes, to which we complain and clamor for redress, for it does not fulfill the expectations it has created. So what we've ended up doing is that he argues, is that there's no way that we can actually figure out what is just or unjust, because we're using these words in ways that don't actually have any meaning. And so it's not just an error for him, but he says it belongs to the category of nonsense, to like the term a moral stone. Just like we wouldn't call a stone moral or not, it doesn't make sense to call a society just or not, because a society does not act deliberately. A society is not a person that intentionally acts, for which we could evaluate just or unjust actions. So what is justice instead? He argues in the Constitution of Liberty that when we talk about justice, it should be about the equality of general rules of law and conduct. That we need to have equality before the law and fair rules of procedures, such that the individual differences that he believes are natural and good in a society, he writes, provide no justification for the government to treat them differently. So a kind of equal protection and equal fairness under the law, based on no kind of non-discrimination. That this is the only thing that justice and equality can mean. That when we apply it to the social distributions of the outcomes of a market society, that we are abusing this idea of justice and applying it to something that can never be achieved. So equality before the law and material equality, he argues, are not only different but in conflict with each other. And this is setting up the next stage of Hayek's argument, that if we are going to try to achieve some sort of social justice, something closer to material equality, we're going to have to undermine, for Hayek, equality before the law. And so he writes in the Constitution of Liberty that insofar as we want the efforts of individuals to be guided by their own views about prospects and chances, the results of the individual's efforts are necessarily unpredictable, and the question as to whether the resulting distribution of incomes is just has no meaning. This is a kind of summary of this first stage of the argument. So the second stage of the argument is based on the implications of attempting to impose social justice. So here we can think of social justice as this idea that we're going to intervene in the social order to give people what they deserve, right? This kind of Scanlinian idea of like what we owe to each other. But for Hayek, this rests on a series of flawed assumptions. It assumes that we know what people deserve, and violating his assumption of imperfect knowledge. It assumes that all people deserve the same thing, which for him violates the differences of it amongst people. And it assumes that individuals should not be allowed to make their own decisions about what values and goods they want to pursue. And so for him, this creates a kind of snowball, and it's going to necessarily create forms of coercion. He writes on page 67 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, "It was in the belief that something like social justice could thereby be achieved that people have placed in the hands of government powers which it cannot now refuse to employ in order to satisfy the claims of those ever-increasing number of special interests who have learned to employ the open sesame of social justice. I believe that social justice will ultimately be recognized as the will-o'-the-wisp which has lured men to abandon many of the values which in the past have inspired the development of civilization, and attempt to satisfy a craving inherited from the traditions of the small group, but which is meaningless in the great society of free men." That once we kind of create and authorize the government to use coercive powers to enforce social justice, that we've kind of opened Pandora's box for Hayek. And this is because social justice for him, again, is actually impossible, right? Conceptually, it's nonsense, as we've just discussed for Hayek, but practically, and this is an argument he makes more clearly in both The Road to Serfdom and in other volumes of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, that it's practically impossible, that we can't plan a utopia, that we're never going to be able to ensure that this kind of material equality or that everyone has what they deserve. And so this failure is going to lead to a snowballing into more and more demands for government power. He writes on page 83 of your reading, while an equality of rights under a limited government is possible and an essential condition of individual freedom, a claim for equality of material position can only be met by a government with totalitarian powers. That we're eventually going to kind of keep for Hayek, keep giving the government more and more power in order to satisfy this impossible demand for social justice that's going to culminate in a totalitarian government. So this is the kind of end point of demands for social justice for Hayek. You are probably familiar with forms of this argument in discussions around social justice in the 21st century. This is kind of where this argument comes from. So we get some strange passages in Law, Legislation, and Liberty. In the preface, he writes of John Rawls that the differences between us seemed much more verbal than substantial. We agree on what to me is the essential point. Now, in the preface, he admits that while he was writing this book, he did not have access to a theory of justice. So he was kind of describing Rawls based on his memory of discussing Rawls, or memory of reading some of Rawls's earlier papers. Rawls himself, as a younger, before in the 60s, was a member of the Mont Pèlerin Society before he kind of withdrew his membership as the Mont Pèlerin Society became more and more kind of right-leaning. The Hayek here, on page 100 of your reading, maintains that he has no basic quarrel with Rawls except over terminology. So my question for you to think about is, is this true? Are Hayek and Rawls really just differing in terms of terminology, or are there more fundamental differences between Hayek and Rawls? Or what might be rhetorically at stake in Hayek's claim that that the difference is between more verbal than substantial? So we can think of, there's definitely some significant overlap between the two. They both reject the idea of moral desert. They both believe that society is primarily made up of individuals. They are liberals in this sense, and they both prioritize fair and free procedures. However, where Rawls believes that political and social justice support each other, that the morally arbitrary differences should be corrected by a theory of justice, Hayek believes that there's a fundamental tension between political justice, which we can think of as equality under the law, and social justice. And therefore, morally arbitrary differences shouldn't be corrected for Hayek. Because he's concerned with enforcement in a way that Rawls is not, and he's concerned with what type of government and how much power you would have to give to that government to create this form of justice. So in your discussion threads, I'll invite you to think through some of this argument. But first, next class, so next Monday, we're going to be turning to a different line of critiquing Rawls's theory, kind of social contract approach to justice. Here, we're looking at perspectives from both feminist theory and critical race theory, an excerpt from Pateman's The Sexual Contract, and an excerpt from Mills's The Racial Contract. So this is the kind of different set of critiques that we're going to look at next class. So for your discussion thread for today, you can either assess Hayek's claim that the differences between theory and Rawls's are verbal, not substantial. Do you think Rawls would agree with this? Or you can compare and contrast Rawls and Hayek on an empirical example of a question of social or distributive justice that you care about. Again, these should be 200-word posts you can write on this topic or on the threads from Rawls, and these are due by Friday at midnight. And then you also are responsible for a 100-word reply to appear by Sunday at midnight. So that is it for today's lecture on Hayek. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop into office hours or the discussion section Wednesday afternoon at 4. Again, if you have questions about the paper, send me an email, drop into office hours. I'm happy to talk through the paper prompts in more detail with you, look over talk through your theses or how you've structured the argument so far. If you're having trouble finishing the material, if you're concerned about deadlines, send me an email and we'll work through something that will be fair to everyone. Until next class, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you then. Take care.